Shalom and welcome to another in our series of podcasts from Temple Beth Am, a dynamic center for conservative Judaism in Los Angeles.
I'm Havivi. I'm the chair of the Temple Beth Am Green Team, which we have resuscitated this year after a decade of dormancy in honor of the 5782 Shemitah year. Keep an eye on your monthly emails and the Green Team button under Get Involved on the TVA website. We have sort of a focus of individual and family activity every month. This past month, I should say October Cheshvan, it's been eat less meat. And so in concert with that theme, we're having two talks this week, one by Rabbi Elliot Dorff, now, who's going to be talking about the Jewish ethics of animal welfare, Tsar Balei Chaim. And then on Thursday evening, the 11th, in 2 more days at 7:30 p.m., our very own grew up at TBA, Melissa Hoffman, who works for something called the Jewish Initiative for Animals, which is a subsidiary or a project of an organization called Farm Forward, is going to be speaking on Jewish communal eating, a response to factory farming. So Rabbi Dorff is going to be talking about the Jewish and halachic aspects of care for animals, and Melissa is going to be focusing more on the realities of factory farming in the United States and what it means for beef, poultry, and eggs to get to our plate. Just to look ahead, in December, our next set of programs also in the same week. This is not, you haven't gotten publicity on this yet, but you will. On Tuesday, December 14th at noon, Rabbi Nina Beth Cardin is going to be talking about her conservative movement rabbinic responsum or tshuva on sustainability as a mitzvah. And then the next night, Wednesday, December 15th at 7:30, since it's just post-Hanukkah, the holiday when the oil lasted for 8 days, we're going to take the opportunity to start talking about the oil and gas industry in California. The first talk for that will be Wednesday, the 15th, December 15th in the evening. Ingrid Lobet, who is a freelance journalist on the oil and gas beat, is going to be talking about the facts on history of the oil and gas industry in California. We hope that in January that's going to be followed by a next program, which is actually going to be about local community efforts to deal with, which might mean monitor better and or shut down the oil well at Pico and La Cienega in all our backyards. So that's what we're doing. So today we can go till 1:15 as a hard stop time. It's usually sort of 12 to 1, but I find that these classes tend to linger over a little bit. So we set till 1:15. So without further ado, Rabbi Dorff.
Well, first of all, Javi, thank you for putting this entire program together. I mean, it's a real boon for the congregation and for all of us that are learning with you. It's kol hakavod, really. I know this is not part of your job description at UCLA Medical Center, right? Okay. I'm going to share some sources with you and simply talk about them first. But please interrupt me at any point if you have questions or you want to ask things about them. And then after we look at the sources, I'm going to try to apply them to some very contemporary issues with regard to animals and the use of animals. So one just background comment, which I take it you understand from day one, but still, the biblical and rabbinic sources come from a time and a place in which a lot of Jews were involved in agriculture, in the use of animals for all kinds of reasons. Not the case for, I would imagine, everybody on this Zoom call, right? We're all city slickers. And, most of our lives have not been working with animals. It may be the case that for some of you that's incorrect, but I'll just say, at least for me, right? I grew up in Milwaukee and we did have to, the dairy state. So we did actually watch cows being milked at one point in elementary school. and we actually had to take cream and shake it for 3 hours to show that it became butter, but it didn't look yellow. That was, added, that food coloring was added after the fact. So, I mean, I didn't grow up in Los Angeles. I grew up in a sort of quasi-agricultural community, but truthfully, I've never worked on a farm or anything like that. And so these sources that I'm going to share with you, they'll come from people who are actually working with animals day in and day out, including some of the rabbis. I mean, both Hillel and Rabbi Akiva are shepherds. That's what they do for a living, right? And so they are rabbis, though they be, are very much involved with animals. Others were tanners, that dealt with, had to cultivate animals and then kill them and skin them, and others were involved in other kinds of trades that involved animals a lot, and not just as pets. So we're going to see actually in some of these sources where rabbis actually interact with animals in a particular way. Okay, so let me share the screen. Let me ask you, do you all have the sources in front of you, or should I share the screen?
We have them.
You have them. Okay, so then
I think you should. I think you should share the screen.
It's a little easier, though.
Yeah, I think you should share the screen.
Okay.
Yes, please.
I don't know how to get them on my screen.
Yeah, Rabbi Dorff is going to screen share then.
There we go.
That's better.
Okay.
Great.
Good. Okay, so what I've done in putting together these sources is divide them into three categories. One, having to do with the physical suffering of animals, and then second, with the psychological or emotional suffering of animals, and then third, the legal status of these rules. So first,
sorry, Rabbi Dorff, could you enlarge that?
Yeah, let me see. How do I do that? Let's see.
And if you all click view options, you can enlarge it, I think, to what's comfortable for your own eyes. It's on the top.
Let's see. Hold on. There's something here that I'm supposed to do to. Oh, wait a minute. Oh, I can. Hold on. I can do this, can't I? Hold on. Select all and make it. Let's say like that. Is that better?
Not really, is it?
Good. Okay. So the first one, Genesis chapter 9, every creature that lives shall be yours to eat. This is different from Adam and Eve, right, where they were only allowed to eat of the fruits and vegetables and, I suppose, grains that were there, but not of anything with an animal characteristic. Whereas this is now after Noah. Every creature that lives shall be yours to eat, as with the green grasses. I give you all of these. You must not, however, eat flesh with its lifeblood in it. And Rashi on that verse connects it here. He here prohibited to them Eber min achai, that is the eating of a limb cut from a living animal. That is to say, basar benafsho, literally flesh together with its life, means so long as its life is in you, you shall not eat the flesh. Now, you might say, ugh, right? In other words, I wouldn't do that altogether. But you need to know that through the Middle Ages, some of you may remember the movie, what's it called? Billy, something or other, where they have one scene there. It takes place during the Middle Ages, where he literally takes a limb from an animal and starts eating it. So, I mean, even if that's not something that you would think of doing, you need to know that it's not at all uncommon in other societies to allow eating flesh from a living animal, right? But here, the Torah, as understood by our tradition anyway, very early on, makes that a prohibition. And that, it turns out to be, because it was given to Noah, it turns out to be one of the prohibitions that are prohibited not just to Jews, but to all children of Noah. So in the list that the rabbis later come up with of the 7 prohibitions that apply to all children of Noah, this is one of them, right? It's probably not something that you would have expected right off. I mean, you would have expected prohibitions against murder and theft and maybe idolatry and licentiousness and things like that. But this happens to be one of the, and I actually have done that with students every once in a while. I would say, if you were creating a list of 6 prohibitions and 1 positive commandment that everybody in the world should be subject to which my mother was an English teacher, to which everybody in the world should be subject, right? What would be on your list? And, they almost always come up with murder and theft and things like that, and rape and things on that order. But almost nobody comes up with Ever Min Achai. And part it's because my students are generally city slickers, so they wouldn't think of it. But in part it's because this has been so ingrained in our culture that you sort of see it as being obvious that if you're going to eat meat, you have to take at least have some concern for the suffering of the animal whose meat you are eating. Then Exodus 20 and Deuteronomy 5. These are the 10 commandments, of course. 6 days shall you labor and do all your work, but the 7th day is the Sabbath of the Lord your God. You shall not do any work, you, your son or daughter, your male or female slave, or your cattle, or the stranger who is within your settlements. And in Deuteronomy, which from an historical point of view is probably about 4 centuries later, the Exodus Law Code, scholars think was certainly in place by the time of David, around 1000 or so before the Common Era. And Deuteronomy is about 400 years later. Right there, it's your son or daughter, your male or slave or female slave, your ox or your donkey or any of your cattle. Right, all of them shall have rest on the 7th day. Now, again, this may seem sort of obvious to you, but you need to know that even for human beings, in the Greek world, the fact that the Greeks thought Jews were lazy because they took off 1 day out of 7, right? And if that's true for human beings, all the more so for animals. So this kind of rule, which may seem, very, very, you might be very sanguine about it. You might say that yes, indeed, not only human beings, but animals need to have 1 day off out of 7. You need to know that that's not at all a slam dunk in the ancient world, and for that matter, into the medieval and modern world, where, as we are seeing now, because of COVID, a lot of people who are working impossible hours at very low wages are refusing to come back to work now because they have come to recognize that, work can be an idol, that you worship 7 days a week, 24/7, right? But that it should not be, and that this kind of rule that applies not only to human beings but also to animals is an important kind of rule to abide by, so that work does not become an idol. Then next, when you see the donkey of your enemy lying under its burden and would refrain from raising it, you must nevertheless raise it up. Okay, now this is presumably this is an animal that has a burden on it, like a donkey, that was used for carrying things. This is all obviously before cars, trucks, trains, planes, all of that, right? So they would use donkeys to carry things. And it was lying under its burden. You must nevertheless raise it with him, even though this person is your enemy. It belongs to your enemy. And then the other one, that is, again, 4 centuries later, if you see your fellow's donkey or ox fallen under the road, so this is somebody that you don't have antipathy toward, but quite the opposite, that is somebody that is a member of your community, reyacha, right? You do not ignore it. You must help him raise it. Now, this is presumably an obligation to the owners of these animals, right? And the question then becomes, well, what kind of a burden are we talking about? Why is the animal lying down under the burden? So this is, you get in the Mishnah. There is a mitzvah by this. I just copy this from Svaria, and what Svaria does is it puts in bold print the words that are actually translations of the Hebrew or Aramaic, but it puts in regular print what you need to know in order to make it a sentence. In other words, what's being presumed by the Hebrew or the Aramaic words. That's why some of these words are in bold print and some are not, but it's all part of the same source. There is a mitzvah by Torah law to unload a burden, but there is no mitzvah to load it. That's what's called the Tanakama, the first opinion, and it doesn't have any name associated with it. So that's usually understood to be the majority opinion, that there is a mitzvah by Torah law to unload a burden in order to unload the suffering that the animal has in carrying the burden, but there is no mitzvah to load it, right? Even though you have these two verses in Exodus 23 and Deuteronomy 22, the Tanakhama here is saying you have no mitzvah to load it on them. What you had in Exodus 23 and Deuteronomy 22 was to help your fellow Jew, whether a friend of yours or not, to raise up the animal that is being needed to carry a burden. But there's no mitzvah to begin with to load an animal. Rabbi Shimon says there is even a mitzvah to load the burden. Rabbi Shimon disagrees and says, no, as a matter of fact, because we in the ancient world use animals to carry our burdens for us, that's part of what it means to be an animal, a beast of burden, literally. So if you're talking about a donkey or an ox, which are used often to carry a burden, then there's a mitzvah to load the burden in order to help your friend who owns the animal have this animal, use this animal in the way that it's normally used. Rabbi Yossi Aglila says, if there was a burden upon the animal greater than its typical burden, one need not attend to it, as it is stated under its burden. So in other words, if your friend or your enemy has put on the animal too heavy a load, then you have one need not attend to it. That is, you're not supposed to help this other person load onto the animal a burden that is too heavy for it, right? And as it is stated under its burden, that is, the obligation is in regard to a burden that an animal can bear. But if your fellow Jew, whether a friend or an enemy, is trying to load onto the animal, a burden that is much too great for it, then then those laws don't apply to this case. You have no obligation to help your friend or your enemy load onto an animal a burden that is too heavy for it. Because presumably your obligation to the animal here takes precedence over your obligation to your fellow Jew, whether a friend or an enemy. So here you're getting a real sense of our obligations to animals that can, in some cases, as in this one, supersede your obligation to your fellow Jew who wants to use this animal to carry a burden, right? In the next one, in the Babylonian Talmud on this, unloading is performed for free, and loading is performed with remuneration. That's the Tanakama, right? So in other words, why would that be the case? Well, what would you think? Let me ask you. What would you guess? Okay, Jody.
Well, the argument you're making is that the reason why Rava said this is because loading is harder on the animal.
Right.
So there are different opinions on whether you have to get paid or not for the work. But Rava jumps in and says, wait. The key thing is not causing suffering. The thing is, though, you can load an animal and it doesn't necessarily suffer too much. It may not like it.
Right.
But Rava never says you can never use a pack animal.
No, quite the opposite. Right. What's going on here is, the assumption is that you may use a pack animal for carrying a reasonable burden, right? But if you're talking about an animal that is lying down because of its burden, you have to presume that that the animal, at any rate, is not just lazy, but that the animal is feeling this as being too heavy a load, and so therefore unloading it has to be performed for free out of a duty to the animal. But loading it is performed with remuneration, namely your obligation to your fellow Jew to load an animal, a pack animal, in its normal load is not something that you do for free, that you have to do for free. Rather, that's a job, and whoever owns the animal and wants to load this burden on the animal has to pay you if that person wants your cooperation in doing that, in loading the animal, right? Rabbi Shimon says both this and that, both the loading and unloading, are performed for free. What do you think the reason is behind his position? He's a minority here, but still, what would you guess his reasoning is? Go ahead, yeah?
Yeah, well, loading would be done as an obligation to your fellow Jew, and unloading would be done as an obligation to the animal.
Yeah, or the loading and unloading could be both to your fellow Jew, right? If your fellow Jew needs some help, not everything has to be done for pay, right? And so there are certain obligations we have to each other to help each other out. Now, presumably, this would be a one-time thing. I mean, if your friend who owns an animal wants you to help him load the animal day after day after day, that's not reasonable. Okay, but if it's a one-time thing, and the animal has fallen down under the load and it's a reasonable load, then even that you should do for free. You should help your friend or your enemy, for that matter, do it for free. But again, the presumption here is not as a regular job, that this is a one-time thing, right? As an obligation to your fellow Jew, whether you like him or not. And then what Jody was talking about before, Rava says, from the statements of both of these Tanaim, that is both the Tanna Kama and Rabbi Shimon, it can be learned that the requirement to prevent suffering to animals is by Torah law. Now, that's pretty clear for the Tanna Kama. Unloading is performed for free. So presumably their issue is suffering of the animals. But what do you think, why do you think that Rava thinks that Rabbi Shimon is asserting this? If even loading the animal is to be done for free, then how is that at all relevant to the suffering of the animal? Jody, go ahead.
Well, it isn't, but it says in the text, you must help him raise it.
Yes.
So you can't just, I mean, you can take it all off and then raise the donkey and then leave the stuff on the ground. That the text itself makes a bigger obligation on you to help him get it on its way, in a way.
Yes, that's right. So on the one hand, even for Rabbi Shimon, even the loading of the load back onto the animal is to be done for free, because that is something, again, not as a regular thing, okay, but as a one-time thing. That is something that is preventing suffering to animals by virtue of the fact that you're taking the load off of the animal and repositioning it. Maybe the problem was not the amount of the load, but the position on which it had been loaded, right? Repositioning it so that the animal is not suffering by carrying this load. All right. So the way that Rava is understanding even Rabbi Shimon, let alone the Tanna Kama, is that that preventing suffering to animals is by Torah law. Torah law being the two verses in Exodus and Deuteronomy that we looked at just a few minutes ago. Now, all of this so far is in regard to physical suffering, to prevent the physical suffering of the animal. Another example of that is Deuteronomy 22. You shall not plow with an ox and a donkey together. Now, why not?
So a donkey and an ox are of unequal abilities in terms of their ability to pull. And it would be a hardship probably on the donkey to try and keep up with an ox. It would also be a hardship on the ox to be doing more than its fair share.
That's right, and pulling along the donkey along with it, right? So, I mean, it's not kind to either animal, and you're not allowed to do that because you are causing suffering to both the ox and the donkey if you are doing that. Now, watch this next one. This comes from the Talmud in Bava Metzia. The sufferings of Rabbi Yehuda Nasi. In another place, it turns out that Rabbi Yehuda Nasi suffered a lot with kidney stones, what we would call kidney stones and things like that, right? So the sufferings of Rabbi Yehuda Nasi came upon him due to an incident and left him due to another incident. What was that incident that led to his suffering? There was a certain calf that was being led to slaughter. The calf went and hung its head on the corner of Rabbi Yehuda Nassi's garment and was weeping. Rabbi Yehuda Nassi said to it, "Go as you were created for this purpose." It was said in heaven, since he was not compassionate towards the calf, let afflictions come upon him. So the presumption is, now, any of you who happen to be medical doctors would doubt this, I would imagine, and probably rightfully so, right? But medicine in the ancient world was not where it is today, and in any case, they were trying to explain how Rabbi Yehuda Nassi, after all, the president of the Sanhedrin, the editor of the Mishnah, why should he suffer? And so one of the reasons that they gave was this, namely that he was not kind to this calf. Now, he may, as far as we know, he was a meat eater and was probably, perfectly willing to have the animal slaughtered in the correct way, and then the blood taken out. In other words, keeping kosher, as it were, and eating meat under those rules. But that wasn't the question here. The question here was his attitude toward the animal that was clearly suffering at the time. Okay? But his afflictions left him due to another incident. One day, the maidservant of Rabbi Yehuda Nassi was sweeping his house. There were young weasels lying around, and she was in the process of sweeping them out. Rabbi Yehuda Nassi said to her, "Let them be, as it is written, the Lord is good to all, and his mercies are over all his works." They said in heaven, since he was compassionate, we will be compassionate on him, and he was relieved of his suffering. Right? Now, again, this is not what doctors, I think, would prescribe as a remedy for kidney stones. Okay? That's not what's going on here, right? What's going on here is really part of the problem of evil, namely, why do good people suffer? And what they are trying to say is that both their suffering and the relieving of their suffering, in this case, was a function of Rabbi Yehuda Nassi's relationship to animals, and that even if you notice, these sources are not saying that you have to be a vegetarian, right? These sources are just saying that if you are going to kill animals for food, then you at least have to be as aware of their suffering and relieve it as much as possible, including even while they're long before they get to the slaughterhouse, and they have some kind of they have fear. The calf was apparently weeping, and so you need to be kind to the weeping animal in the same, maybe not quite the same way or to the same degree, but you have to be kind to a weeping animal as you would be to a weeping person. Okay?
Rabbi Dorff,
yes, go ahead, Avi, go ahead.
I just want to make a brief observation, and I guess maybe this is like other things in the Torah also, that the Torah just has a few laws pertaining to animals. You could also add in like sending away the mother bird, what you're going to have. But the Torah doesn't anywhere articulate a principle, right? Be compassionate to animals.
Right.
It's really the Talmud inferring these principles from the Torah and first sort of stating it as a philosophical principle, as it were, a general principle.
That's right. The general principle does not appear in the Torah. The general principle only appears in the Talmud, Tsar Baalei Chayim, pain to living animals, and but it is a generalization over some very specific Torah laws, like the one in Exodus that I mentioned before in Deuteronomy, and now we're going to go to psychological suffering. I must say that the fact that the Torah prohibited physical suffering of animals is wonderful, don't get me wrong, and was not at all the case in other societies, but it's the kind of sort of bottom, sort of threshold moral rule that you would expect to some extent. If you had any connection to animals whatsoever, you may want to say, well, I don't want to watch them suffer. But the interesting thing is that there are three different rules in the Torah that talk about the animal's psychological suffering, right? And this, I think, is really well beyond what at least I'm aware of in any other culture in the ancient world. First, do not muzzle an ox on the threshing floor, right? Now, why not? First of all, what is a threshing floor? Before I get to that, right? Come on, city slickers. What would you guess is a threshing floor?
Where they go round and round to get the chaff out of the grain.
That's right. Today we do that by machine. That is not, I would imagine, anybody on this call, but farmers do this by machine now, right? But in the ancient world, they didn't have that. And so what happened is to get to get the wheat separated from the chaff. By the way, wheat doesn't, let me start from the beginning, right? This I actually have seen. When wheat grows, right, it doesn't just grow as kernels of wheat. It grows within what's called chaff. It grows within a covering that you have to remove in order to get to the kernel of wheat. And so the way that they did that was that they had a threshing floor above that was like below a kind of basement, as it were, right? And the threshing floor was constructed in such a way that, first of all, it was very strong because you're going to have oxen going around and around in it, and oxen are very heavy. And it was done in such a way that there were holes in the threshing floor so that the kernels of wheat could fall to the bottom, to the basement, basically, right? So these oxen would go round and around, seeing these kernels of wheat within their covering, what's called the chaff, and probably want to eat them, right? But if you put a muzzle on the ox's mouth, then the oxen sees this food but cannot eat it. So that would cause psychological suffering to the animal, right? It's sort of, here's this food, but I can't get to it. It's and Rashi on this verse says, Scripture is speaking of what usually occurs, but the same, namely that it's an ox on a threshing floor. But the same rule applies to any cow, non-domesticated beast, and fowl that are doing some work that is connected with food. So in other words, he's saying that this is not just about oxen, this is about any animal. But if so, why does Scripture state ox? To exclude a human being from being subject to this law. That is, if he restrains a workman from eating while engaged in some operation connected with food, the master is exempt from the flagellation usually inflicted on one who transgresses a negative commandment, right? So if you have people working for you in the food industry, right, maybe even not at the beginning of it, like, in the harvesting and all of that, but in the actual preparation of the food, you can insist that your workers not eat the food that they're preparing, right? This rule does not prohibit that. And as a matter of fact, there is another part of the Talmud in Bava Metzia that talks about people who are threshing, and because there's another rule in Deuteronomy that says that the workers are allowed to eat of some of the food that they are threshing, that they are harvesting. And then the question becomes, well, what percentage of the food that they're harvesting are they allowed to eat? So that's in regard to workers. Okay. But what Rashi is pointing out here is that this law does not apply to human beings. For that, you have to have separate laws having to do with workers' rights. That's a whole different story. Then if a bird's nest happens to be before you on the road, in a tree or on the ground with young ones or eggs, and the mother is sitting on the young one and the young or the eggs, you shall not take the mother with the young, but let her go. The young you may take for yourself, that it may go well with you and prolong your days. So it's not that you may not take the eggs, or even the chicks if they've already hatched, right? But you must shoo away the mother bird first, presumably for what reason? What would you guess?
To prevent psychological distress.
That's right. To prevent the mother from having to see her baby chicks or the eggs that she laid being taken away from before her, because the presumption of the Torah is that the mother bird really wants to culture these eggs and see her children, right? See her children thrive, not see her children being taken away to be eaten. Now you're going to see later that Ramban suggests another reason as well, but I think the direct reason is what Ellis just said. Another one, Leviticus 22. From 8 days old, an animal may be brought as an offering, but whether it be a cow or you must not kill it and its young both in one day. So again, the presumption is that that animals suffer psychological pain as well as physical pain, and our obligation is to prevent both. Now, Rambam gives you that reason, but another one as well. The reason for both commandments is that we should not have a cruel heart and be uncompassionate, where it may be that Scripture does not permit us to destroy a species altogether, although it permits slaughter for food within that group. In other words, he's arguing really two different reasons. One is that you should be compassionate and should not kill a bird together with its young on the same day, or an animal together with its young on the same day. Or it may be that Scripture does not permit us to destroy a species altogether, although it permits slaughter for food within that group. Biodiversity, right? Basically what Nachman is saying in the 13th century is that we have to be careful to preserve the biodiversity in nature. Now, he who kills the mother and the young in one day, or takes them when they are free to fly, is regarded as though he cut off that species. And that's we're not allowed to do. Now, interestingly, do you know about Jainism? Jainism is a religion that began in India, and still most Jains live in India, but there's a fairly strong Jain community in Southern California. And I actually went to a conference at Claremont about Jainism, and it was a day-long conference. And the Jains are not only vegans, but they will not allow people to eat either carrots or potatoes because those are root vegetables, and if you take out the carrot, you're taking out any remainder of it. So you at least endanger the possibility. You bring the danger that you will no longer be able to have carrots in the world. So they will not eat root vegetables. They're not only vegan, it's sort of vegan plus. And to some extent, that's what Ramban is talking about in the 13th century, something that in modern times we talk about as the importance of maintaining biodiversity. But he already had that sense that we have an obligation to try to maintain the various diverse Marabu Maseka Adonai, right? How wide and diverse are your creations, God, in Psalm 104, the Psalm for Rosh Chodesh, and we're supposed to make sure that we don't take the young and the mother animals at the same time, because of the worry about maintaining that biodiversity. Now, one last section here, and then I want to talk about some contemporary issues. We already saw Rabbi saying that the requirement to prevent suffering animals is a Torah law, and that then leads to this segment in Shabbat 128 in the Talmud. Rabbi Yehuda said in the name of Rav, with regard to an animal that fell into an aqueduct on Shabbat, one brings cushions and blankets and throws them into the water ditch and places them beneath the animal in the aqueduct. And if the animal thereby emerges, it emerges. But even if it doesn't, what's the point of throwing cushions and blankets into the aqueduct?
So the animal won't drown, so it can have something to stand on.
That's right. One reason is so that an animal will not drown. What would be another reason, do you think? So it's comfortable, right? It's not suffering in the aqueduct, but it has actually cushions and cushions and pillows there, and blankets even, and it will enable it possibly to even get out of the aqueduct, right? If the animal thereby emerges, it emerges, so that whatever suffering it's enduring, you can do that. And an objection was raised from a Tosefta with regard to an animal that fell into an aqueduct on Shabbat. One provides it with sustenance in its place so that it will not die, because you have no idea how hungry it is. But then the Gemara asks, does he not, by placing cushions and blankets, negate a vessel's preparedness, which you're not allowed to do on Shabbat? It's a Tolada, one of the 39 malachot, right? You're not allowed to ruin something that you would normally use for some purpose. Okay, that's a toledah of destruction. You're not allowed to build something on Shabbat, and you're also not allowed to destroy it. So negating a vessel's preparedness is a toledah, that's a correlation of the prohibition to destroy something on Shabbat. The cushions and blankets are no longer fit for their designated use in Shabbat, and this negation of their designated use is similar to the prohibition labor of dismantling, or in other words, destroying. The Gemara answers, Rav holds that negating a Torah vessel's preparedness is prohibited by rabbinic law. It's not a malacha, it's a toledah, right? It's a derivative of the Torah law, right? That negating a vessel's preparedness is prohibited by rabbinic law. Causing a living creature to suffer is a Torah prohibition, and a matter prohibited by Torah law comes and overrides a matter prohibited by rabbinic law. So here's what's going on here is that the prohibition to cause, at least as in Rav's position and also in Rava, as we saw earlier, right? Their position is that Rava, by the way, was a student of Rav. Their position is that undermining or preventing suffering from animals is a Torah prohibition, and therefore it takes precedence over any of the rabbinic legislation in regard to Shabbat. And then Rambam, many years later, of course, in the 12th century, says, in the case of one who climbed a tree inadvertently on Shabbat, it is permissible to descend. But if you did it volitionally, it is forbidden to descend. Why do you think that's the case? If you were just having fun and you decided to climb a tree, right? Why is it required that you stay in the tree all day on Shabbat and not come down until after Shabbat? What would you guess?
You'll break branches and pull off leaves.
Exactly. Which you're not allowed to do on Shabbat, right? But if he climbed on an animal, he must descend, even when he intentionally climbed onto it, on account of the prohibition of causing pain to animals. And we must likewise remove the load from on top of an animal on Shabbat on account of pain to animals. So you've got here a number of sources that maintain that it is that Tsar Balei Chaim is not just a rabbinic invention, that because it is a generalization over a number of Torah laws, Tsar Balei Chaim itself is of Torah status, okay, and therefore takes precedence over any rabbinic law. Yeah, Jody, go ahead.
Okay, so this is all the past stuff, right? But I want to jump in because I've been studying this subject, and these are lovely texts, but you are so cherry picking, Elliot.
Oh, yeah.
Because this Torah law does not take precedence. It is not by any means absolute. If you need to use that animal and suffering occurs in the normal course of using that animal, it's fine. It's also, and there are all these horrible nightmare Talmud texts that I've been looking at that allow you, that where they even talk about Rava, what he says, and he's overridden. For example, there's one, let's say you go to a Gentile fair of Ovdei Avodah Zarah, and you buy yourself a horse. You're not supposed to do that. And so not only are you punished, the horse is punished. And they discuss, how are you going to punish the horse? So they say, cut off its legs from the knee down. And others say, no, just starve it to death. And someone says, oh, but how about Tsar Balei Chaim? And say, no, too bad. This takes precedence. Same thing with when you bring a mother and a calf on a Yom Tov to bring it to the Kohen and they fall into a pit. Can you take out both of them? No, you can only take out one because you can't kill the mother and her calf on the same day. So one's got to suffer. Oh, but some say, but what if you just pretend, oh, I'm going to take out the mother because I'm going to sacrifice her. And then you change your mind. You do like a little trick. Can't you do that? And they say, oh, I want the son, I want the baby. And they say they overrule it. So there are all sorts of ways that this Torah law gets overruled within the Talmud. Now, maybe Maimonides doesn't, but the Talmud doesn't really give that much of a hoot about this Torah law. I mean, they might in these texts, but in other ways, they don't. And you even have someone like Ramban saying, well, we don't really care about suffering that much because we can eat the animal and we know the animal suffers when you kill it, even if you do it according to Shechita and all the proper things.
Okay,
So
good.
they themselves have this thing. Well, but it can suffer in the course of using it. Using it is not just eating it, it's labor, getting its fur, wild animals, getting, their mink, whatever.
Good. Thank you. We did not plan this. That was exactly the segue to what I was going to talk about, namely the other side of this.
Yes.
Right? And the other side of it, Jody just told you very articulately and rightfully, namely, after it's all said and done, the tradition understood it to be permissible to use animals, even if it caused them some pain, and not only seemed permissible, it was sort of standard operating procedure, right? It wasn't a one every once in a while this happened. This was every day. I mean, animals were used for doing all kind, like on the threshing floor and to carry burdens and all of that, and not Shabbat probably, but every other, and not Chagim, but on other days of the week, it was perfectly permissible to slaughter them and to eat them, and to use their fur or to use their hides. And as a matter of fact, that's exactly what we do in order to create the Sefer Torah, no less, right? So the question then became, over the course of centuries, how do you balance these things? On the one hand, we are allowed to use animals and even to eat them, at least some of them. But actually, Jacob Milgram, Alav Shalom, in one of his articles, estimated that 96% of the animal kingdom is forbidden to Jews to eat, and only about 4% of the animal kingdom is permitted to Jews to eat, and then under very specific circumstances, in terms of how the slaughter happens, taking the blood out, and how they're prepared, how they're served, all of that. But still, in the end, Jewish law does not require one to be a vegetarian or a vegan, right? Quite the opposite. During the Middle Ages, at least, the presumption was that people were poor, and that if they were going to eat meat, it was only going to be on Shabbat, and that was one of the ways in which you were Zachor Yom HaShabbat L'Kadsho. If you came across an animal that you were going to be able to eat, since you couldn't eat it, during the week and have it left for Shabbat, one of the ways you remembered Shabbat was that you preserved it for your meals on Shabbat, right? And that was one of the ways. That was owning Shabbat. That was one of the ways of remembering Shabbat and causing you joy. So, in the same sort of way, what I wanted to deal with was some contemporary examples. In particular, I do a lot of bioethics. And I was on a federal commission from 2000 to 2002 called National Human Resources Protections Advisory Commission. It was a commission to review and revise the federal guidelines on research on human beings after Jesse Gelsinger, a 26-year-old Jewish guy actually, died as a result of medical experiments at University of Pennsylvania, and Ellen Roach, a 24-year-old young woman, died as a result of medical experiments at Hopkins. Now, Penn and Hopkins are first-rate medical centers, and so this commission was called into existence in the waning months of the Clinton administration and lasted for about 2 years into the W administration. And we were supposed to review and revise the federal guidelines on this, on research on human beings. Along the way, we were also looking at guidelines in regard to the use of animals for medical research, and I'm sorry to tell you, also for research on cosmetics. Namely, how are animals used in the United States for both of these purposes? Let me just say that the use for cosmetics is really, really controversial, but it's done every day of the week, right? And both in terms of creating new kinds of cosmetics and in terms of testing them on animal skins before they're tested on human skins, right? And in regard to medicine, all the more so. It is presumed to be the moral way to deal with medicines is that when you are are trying to create them, that you test them on animals before you test them on human beings. Now, that sometimes leads to real suffering, right, on the part of animals. And it's and one of the good news that I want to tell you is that because we now have stem cell research, we are able to create stem cell lines on which we are able to test medicines on stem cell lines, which, at least as far as we can tell, do not have consciousness, right? So we're able to test medicines on stem cell lines before we test them on animals, so that at least the worst of them the worst of the diseases, of the medicines that would cause the most suffering, would be able to be ruled out in the stem cell portion of the medical experimentation before they're ever tested on human beings. But even with that, it still is the case that in order for a medicine to be approved by the FDA, and then later approved by the CDC, for any of those medicines to be approved, after you do stem cell line testing, you have to do animal testing before it can be approved for human use. And clearly, the people involved in this are doing what they can to make sure that they're not just going wild and testing anything that comes to be, right? I mean, they are trying to create things that will ultimately benefit humankind, as well as for animals as well. I mean, this is not just medical doctors here; it's also veterinarians that are interested in creating medicines for animals. So, I mean, they have a vested interest in trying to create medicines that will work for both animals and human beings. But it's, I should say, human beings and other animals. But the point is that it is still the case that the protocol is that you test on animals first before you test on human beings. Unfortunately, that sometimes leads to a lot of suffering on the part of animals. But it is thought to be morally correct that it be animals that suffer before you subject this to human beings.
Rabbi Dorff, can I just ask you to stop screen share? Because I think if we're done with the text, if we're done with the text, stop this, so that way we'll all see each other. Great.
Good.
Thanks.
That's good.
Yeah.
Thank you. So I wanted to at least mention that as part of the contemporary issue. The other piece of it, of course, is the animals that are used for food. We, I would say, unfortunately, in America, have major, farm factories in which animals are really, frankly, abused in the process of being cultivated and then also being slaughtered. And in the conservative movement, this goes back at least 8 years, I think. Rabbi Pamela Barmash wrote a tshuva that, frankly, forbids veal that has been cultivated in the really unscrupulous kinds of conditions that little calves are kept in order to gain veal. Why? Because if you let them frolic in the world, they will develop muscles, and the meat will be less tender. It'll be tougher. So in order to avoid that, for veal cows, it is the case that that they often are confined from birth into very small places, right? And so that they grow up with very tender meat. So in her tshuva, it would allow only free-range meat. So when this was passed, I actually asked the head of the kitchen at American Jewish University, do we serve veal at all? And if so, is it free range? And he said, first of all, we don't serve veal very much at all because it's very expensive. And second, to the extent that we do it, it's free range. But I'm sorry to say, not for moral reasons, but for economic reasons. Free range veal is much cheaper than than the other kind of veal, right? Because it's tougher. So, I mean, I do want to mention one other thing, and then I'm going to stop. Many, many years ago, in the 1970s, we had a rabbinical student who came from Denver and was himself a vegetarian. But he did his master's project on kosher slaughter. At that time, I don't know if it's still the case, but a kosher abattoir existed in Denver. And so so he wanted to see what was going on there. And during the winter break, he did that. He got permission to go in. And he told me he went there, expecting to see things that would absolutely abhor him. And in fact, came away from it rather impressed that, first of all, they were not using hoisting and shackling. They were using the Temple Grandin pens, right? And the shochet, in fact, did say a blessing before each and every cow that he slaughtered. So, I mean, there was at least an attention to trying to recognize the dignity of the animal and to minimize its suffering. At least that's what he reported to me. That was part of his master's thesis. So, I mean, I personally am a vegetarian, although when I told, the reason why is because I came across well, first of all, I was never much of a meat eater. And when I ate meat, it had to be very well done. And real carnivores like it raw or close to that. Okay. I married Marlon, and she comes from a real meat eating family. And I guess the message was already very clear when we first got married. They said, all right, we'll have chicken Friday night, but on Saturday noon, let's have something else. Okay. But then I came across this passage in the Talmud. I was a rabbi in residence at Ramah in Chulin, which is not law. It's a matter of derech eretz. It says you should only eat meat under two conditions. One, that you have a great desire for it, which was also really iffy in my case. And second, that you slaughter the animal yourself. No way. I have been queasy since I was a little kid. My father used to love to take me fishing when I was a little kid. And I loved getting up in the morning and being in the boat with him and all of that right by dawn. But to put a worm on a hook, let alone that God forbid I should catch a fish, forget it, right? So I told Marlon, I'm becoming a vegetarian. So she said to me, if you're still eating fish, I'm still cooking for you. Otherwise, you're on your own. So for that very practical and unprincipled reason, I eat fish. Okay. But Marlon still eats meat. And, and I know a lot of very good Jews who eat meat. And I think if you keep kosher, that's at least one step in the right direction. Go ahead, Jody. Yes.
Another question. So I'm interested in the difference between how a conservative rabbi, say like Barnash, that's her name?
Barnash, yeah.
That veal tshuva, which I read, makes a decision versus how an Orthodox rabbi makes a decision. Because the Orthodox rabbi is going to look at the 2,000 years of precedence from the Talmud up to where we are, and he'll ignore what it says in Chulin. He's going to look at the Shulchan Aruch, and he's going to look at later opinions. And of course, you have to eat meat on Shabbat, whatever. But the conservative movement and your decisions are more like you're jumping back to particular principles in the Talmud, and you're giving weight to them. And in fact, you are even saying, I'm really going to accept that it's a Torah law, and I'm not going to accept its exceptions. So you call it halacha, and I will call it halacha, but the Orthodox won't call it halacha because of that method. Can you talk about the method? And I've seen other people who said, well, look at what Milgram says about not eating blood, the spirit, it goes against the spirit. Spirit is not halacha, spirit is something in Agadah, right? So, right? So can you talk about this method?
All right. Can I add to that question?
Sure, please, go ahead.
So I was going to say, okay, we have the veal tshuva. So should there be a tshuva or how would it be how would one decide, let's just say ethical eggs, that the chickens have more room to roam instead of being squashed together? How can someone decide, well, because of suffering, eggs that are not humane certified, which is defined as so much square feet for the chickens, are declared not kosher, like veal. Given that there is principles and counter principles in the halakhic tradition.
All right. So, Jody, I mean, I love this stuff. As a matter of fact, I've written 2 books on methodology, one of which, The Unfolding Tradition, Philosophies of Jewish Law, which is now out of print, but you can get an ebook on Amazon for like $8 or something. The Unfolding Tradition, Philosophies of Jewish Law, in which I discuss 15 different theories of law within the conservative movement, and then compare them to some Orthodox positions on the right and some Reform and further left of the Reform positions on the left, in terms of what constitutes a methodology to interpret and apply Jewish law.
Okay, good.
And then I'll tell you another one. This one, For the Love of God and People, a Philosophy of Jewish Law, namely mine. Okay, For the Love of God and People, which talks about my own philosophy of Jewish law and why I accept that as such. In which what you will find is that, unlike somebody like Joel Roth, who says that there are extra legal considerations to the law, and by the law he simply means that which is written down in text somewhere, right? The way that I understand Jewish law, which is a very, by the way, German way of looking at the law, and he actually quotes Kelsen, who's a German legal theorist, right? The way that I understand Jewish law is that it's an organic system, and that the texts of the law are just one part of what the law is. The law also includes moral issues, social issues, economic issues, what's good for the Jews, and all of that. And one of my favorite stories actually about Jewish law, and which I quote in the book, is I learned from my father. My grandparents lived across the street from a large Orthodox synagogue in Milwaukee, and so my grandparents would host people who showed up on Friday afternoon who needed a place for Shabbat. So when my father was about 15, my grandmother sent him across the street to find out whether there were going to be any such guests on Shabbat. Right? He walked into the rabbi's office, and the rabbi was, according to the Encyclopedia Judaica, the dean of Orthodox rabbis in Milwaukee for 3 generations. All right? My father walked into the office, and there the rabbi's holding a chicken, literally, and there was a woman there, and she wanted to know whether the chicken was kosher, right? So the rabbi is turning the chicken over and over again and asking her all kinds of questions about the health of the family and economically, how's work going and all of that. And he pronounces the chicken kosher, and she leaves. And my father said to him, "Why were you asking her all these questions? She was just asking whether the chicken was kosher." And he said to my father, "If you think the kashrut of the chicken is only a matter of the physical condition of the chicken, you know nothing about Jewish law. Because if I were to pronounce that chicken not kosher, they would have nothing to eat that night. That's what I determined." Right? So, and you have to be, let me just say, you have to be very wary of being what's called a legal positivist. That is, that the only law that's around is what's in the books, right? Custom plays a major role in Jewish law. That's another thing I didn't mention just a moment ago, right? Especially because we are people that's scattered all over the world, right? So what constitutes care of animals, among other things, varies a lot. Now, Joel Roth, who was my junior counselor when I was 15 years old at Camp Vermont, Wisconsin, and we have spent our lives, we are conservative rabbis, and we spend our lives
fighting with each other.
Right? So, I mean, if the proverbial Martian were kind of come down and look at the two of us, he would find, I think, very difficult time distinguishing us. That said, and we are good friends. I mean, this is really not telling bad stories out of school or anything like that, right? But as you'll see in my book, he is a legal positivist, although a soft legal positivist, because he allows for extra legal things to influence the determination of the law. But I think that that's just not Jewish, to be very honest. I think that is very German, right? Because starting with the Torah itself, Michael Fishbane wrote a really very thick and very dense book in 1984-85 on biblical interpretation.
Right.
What he shows is that the later stages of the Torah itself are interpreting and applying the earlier stages, right? All alachat kama v'kama, as it were, in regard to how the rabbis use midrash, both midrash halacha and midrash agadah. So, I mean, to see the law the way that some Orthodox and some conservative rabbis do, as being totally a function of what's in the books, I think is just misunderstanding the nature of Jewish law, right? And that therefore, if we're talking about developing a Jewish law appropriate to how animals are treated in our time, both for food and for medical purposes, we do need to take into account the stories in the Talmud as well as the laws, right, and the development of laws over time, in order to have what I would call an authentic and a wise Jewish law for our time.
I have a short question.
More than you wanted to hear, but
yeah. Sorry, I have a quick. Sorry, I have a quick question. Short question. So we've all heard the party line that kosher slaughter is what it is because that's the most humane way for the animal to die. What is the source of that? Because that is the most humane way for the animal to die. Is that Talmudic or not even?
No, that's not Talmudic, as far as I know anyway, right?
Okay.
And in any case, I mean, Joel Roth and I wrote rather tshuva together about shackling and hoisting animals. And we both said that was a violation of Tsar Balei Chaim. Now, I wanted to go further and say, it's not kosher if you do that. But that he would not do, right? Because along the lines that Jody was just talking about a while ago, right? If you look at the Shulchan Aruch on the laws of kosher slaughter, what is presented as kosher meat in the butcher shops and in the kosher butcher shops does in fact follow those rules, right? The fact that it might violate other rules is another matter, right? But to the left of me is somebody like Arthur Waska, who wants to talk about eco-kashrut, right? Where the issue is not just pain for animals. The issue is what is the ecological implications of raising cows altogether? The methane that comes from their excrement and things like that, right? By the way, there was a very interesting article. We get the New York Times and the LA Times, so I always forget where I read it. But there's some place in Scotland which is developing new ways to raise animals cows, such that their excrement will have less methane in them, something like 60% less. But of course, if you didn't raise them at all, there would be 100% less methane, right? But the point is that still, I mean, the fact of the matter is, as the Torah itself recognizes in the Noah story after the Adam and Eve story, human beings will eat meat. So if that's the case, what you want to do is diminish the negative effects of that, both on human health and also on the environment.
So if I understand that correctly, you would say there might be Jewish principles about why someone should or shouldn't eat something, and we still might not call those principles kashrut.
Right.
You might call it some. By the way, does the Barmash Tshuva say that veal is not kosher, or that it is tsar balei chayim and that's why we shouldn't eat it?
I have to look again at it. I don't remember actually.
Okay.
I think it was a violation of tsar balei chayim. I think
rather than declaring it not kosher.
Yes, that's right.
Larry.
Rabbi Dorff?
Yes.
Yeah, Larry.
I have dozens of questions. I'm only going to ask one. Does the principle of pikuach nefesh apply to animals?
No. And that's the reason why, in that source that I showed you, if an animal falls into an aqueduct, you can't just do whatever you want on Shabbat on the basis of pikuach nefesh, right? So that's why, in that source, they had to deal with it on the basis of tsar balei chayim.
Judaism is not anti-speciesism across the board. Right. Michael Ozer, you had a question? A comment? There's a hand up.
Yes, Rabbi Dorff, why do you think that these the movements toward creating a more sustainable kashrut, sort of ethical kashrut, have never taken on. I mean, I just wanted to know your opinion about why, especially in this day and age, they just never took off.
Well, I mean, I think, and by the way, that's a real issue for the conservative movement, because Rabbi Morris Allen, a colleague of ours, a conservative rabbi in St. Paul, although I think he just retired, created a program with the Rabbinical Assembly in which there was going to be a tav. It was originally called a tav hefsher, what should I say, a marker of being kosher. But then that raised all kinds of questions that we were just talking about. In other words, are you saying that slaughterhouses that don't have this are not actually producing kosher meat? So it was a tav tzedek, I think, was in the end, right? In which the idea would be that in evaluating the fitness of meat for eating, for Jews to eat, you would have taken into account also how the workers were treated, how the animals were treated, and the ecological effects of what was going on in producing the meat. And the idea would be that slaughterhouses, and for that matter restaurants, that abided by the principles that were set out in this document, would get this. Not only they might be kosher, but they would also be righteous, as it were, right? The problem was, and this was really worked out over years, and you can find those documents on the Rabbinical Assembly website if you want. If you have any trouble with that, just tell me and I'll email them to you. The problem was you couldn't get slaughterhouses to do this, right? Because why not? Number one, economically, it would cost them more money, and they weren't convinced that there were enough kosher Jews that would insist on this, right? And then the other thing was, it's just easier to do what we've been doing for years, right? And by the way, why haven't a lot of Jews, become vegetarians? Well, because a lot of people like meat, right? And they're willing to go only so far in worrying about how animals are treated, or in worrying about how people working in slaughterhouses are treated, right? We human beings are not morally ideal. Okay, that's the long and the short of it.
I'm going to call time. Sorry to end on a note of things are not morally ideal, but I think we'd all agree that things are not morally ideal. Okay, but it's important to talk about the ideals and learn about them.
That's right, and to strive for them.
And to strive for them aspirationally, and hopefully not just aspirationally, but actually with movement. So
yes,
movement towards them. So Rabbi Dorff, thanks so much for teaching us today and sharing. And like Larry, I'm sure we all have tons and tons of questions. So hopefully there'll be opportunities for these conversations to continue in the future.
You have been listening to another in our series of podcasts from Temple Beth Am, a dynamic center for conservative Judaism in Los Angeles. If you enjoy these podcasts, we invite you to write a review on the Apple Podcast site or wherever you get your podcasts. For more information about Temple Beth Am Los Angeles, go to tbala.org.